Hello everybody and welcome back to the channel. In this video, we're going to learn how to build a REST API with Express.js. Now for this crash course, you do not need to know any Express of course, but I do expect you to know what a RESTful API is because that's what we are building with Express. So let's just get right into it. So the first thing we need to do is, of course, create a directory where our Express application is going to live. So let's open up our terminal. I'm just going to go ahead and clear everything. And I am going to move into my desktop. And what we're going to be building is simply a to-do application. So we're going to have multiple routes so we can fetch our to-dos. We can fetch one specific to-do. We can update a to-do. We can add a to-do as well as delete a to-do. So let's go here and let's create a directory. I'm going to do that with mkdir. And then I'm going to say to-dos app. I'm going to move into to-dos app and I'm going to do code dot to open up my application in VS Code. If you don't have this command set up, that is not a problem. You can just simply open up your VS Code instance and open up your new application. So I'm going to open up the new integrated terminal. And to do this, of course, we need to have Node.js installed, being that, well, this is a Node RESTful API because Express is a framework that is built on top of Node. So we need to initialize a Node application, and we can do that with npm init-y. Let's go ahead and do that. And now over here, you can see we have our package.json file. Now in here, of course, what we need to do is, well, install Express. And Express is really the only dependency that we need to build this REST API. So let's do npm install and then Express. Very, very simple. And this might take maybe 10 seconds. I don't presume it will take too long, and it didn't take too long. Awesome. So you can see here we have Express. So let's actually go ahead and create our Express server. Now, where is that going to live? Well, it's going to live inside of the index.js file. You can call this whatever it is that you want. Many people call it main.js file, but I think many more call it index.js file. So that's what I'm going to be sticking with. So the first thing we need to do is get Express from, well, the Express package that we downloaded. So over here we have Express. Now, let me just zoom in here a little bit. Now what we need to do is, well, create a new Express app. Now to do that, we can say const app. This is going to be our Express app, and we can invoke Express. So that is what we are going to be doing. So we're going to invoke Express. And now the last thing we need to do is listen on a specific port. So let's go ahead here and let's do app.listen. And we're going to go ahead and listen on port 3000. So that's the first parameter. The second parameter is a callback where we can console.log that we are now listening on port 3000. Let's get rid of this rubbish. Okay, cool. So that is our application. We are getting very, very, very close. I mean, we have pretty much built out our Express app. Now what we need to do is run our application. So to do this, let's open up our terminal. And in here, all we have to do is execute node index. And what that will do is now we are listening on port 3000. Awesome. So this is terrific. Now, if we were to actually go to port 3000, let's get rid of the Canva for now. And let's go to localhost 3000. What we see is this right now. We do not have a route at the moment, so we really can't fetch any data. So the way that Express works and the way that any RESTful API works is that we're exposing routes. So we expose route after route after route. So we have a route for getting to-dos, we have a route for getting one to-do, we have a route for a bunch of different things. So we need to create those routes, of course. And let's actually begin, well, right now. Let's create our very first route where we can get all of the to-dos. So to define a route, we use app, and then we say .get. Now this right here is the verb. So this is the verb. So what we want to do is we want to get data. So we're going to define that this is a get route. This is just a verb. We can have the exact same functionality with any different verbs, and we're going to encounter all of the verbs. As you can see here, we have get, and then there should be something like patch, there's something like put, there's post, but because this route handler is responsible for getting data, it is best practice, and you should probably use the get verb. Okay, so the first thing that we have to do is define, well, the path of this route. So it's going to be localhost 3000 slash what? Well, we're going to say slash to-dos because we want to get all the to-dos. The second parameter is a callback. And this callback also takes in two parameters, the request and the response. So what is the request? Well, when we hit this endpoint, we are making a request to this endpoint. And within that request, you can have multiple different things. You can append some data within the request. You can have some data within the parameters. So this right here is the request. And sometimes we're going to need to parse the request in order to do the functionality that we want to. And over here, this is the response. So this is ultimately what we do inside of this route handler and what we send back. So this is the response, what we want to send back to the user after they made a request. So that is what these two things are. And they're usually not written in full because they're too long, so they're just abbreviated rec and res. Okay. So what we want to do here, what do we want to do here? Well, we want to respond with an array of to-dos. Now in here we can have our logic, we can go fetch our data with an ORM, but again, just for simplicity's sake, let's create a to-dos array right over here. And simply, all we want to do is respond, we want to respond back with those to-dos. Now we could do a res.send, or because at the end of the day we want to send back JSON data, we could do res.json and send back those to-dos. And we can actually end the call by having a return. Very, very simple. Now, we're going to have to close the server and run it again in order to actually see the changes. Now, in order to set up hot reload, and this is what I am going to do, I highly encourage you to run, let me just clear here, inside of your terminal, do an npm install nodemon and then -g. I already installed it, but what this will allow us to do is hot reload our node application. And if you're on Mac or Linux, you might have to prepend sudo and then enter your credentials. So once you have that installed globally, let's go back here, what we can do is open up our package.json file. And inside of our package.json file, well, not in the dependencies, inside of the scripts, we can write a dev script. And what we want to execute in dev is nodemon index.js. So now let's open up our terminal again. And now let's do npm run dev. So you can see here, now we're running on localhost 3000. And I don't think we'll need our terminal much more. Okay, cool. So now let's actually go ahead and test this route. Now, any GET requests, we can actually test in the browser itself. So we can do now localhost /3000/todos. And if we were to do that, you can see here that we get back an array. We can also test out our stuff in something called Postman. Let me zoom in here a little bit. I think this is good. So we can use Postman, and what this does is it simulates a client making a bunch of requests. And you can see here, these are the different verbs that we can utilize. So we can have get, post, put, patch, delete, and there's actually much, much more, and we're not gonna look into these ones. Honestly, I don't even know what some of these do. So we wanna make a request to localhost 3000. So if you don't have Postman, you can go ahead and install it, by the way. It's not a very difficult installation. And you could either use this or something like Insomnia. But once you have it, go over here. And what I want you to do is create a new thing, a new collection for your brand new app. You can call this to do or whatever it is that you want, but I already have one over here for Express. So over here, now what we can do is we can right click on this and add a new request. Once you add a new request, you can see here that we have this new request. I already have one pre-built, a get request that gets all of the to-dos, and this is making a request to localhost :3000/to-dos. So if we were to make this request and send it off, you can see here, and let me zoom in a little bit more actually, you can see here that we get back a wonderful array. That's it. Very simple. We get back this array. Okay, cool. That is awesome. So now what we need is the ability to actually add to-dos. So let's do something like app.post and then to-dos. And so this is a brand new verb that we are going to be utilizing because this is something, this verb is used when we are adding data. This is a very common verb that is used when adding data. So post request. So over here we have the rec and the res, so the request and the response. Now, in this case, what we need to do is we need to, know, what kind of data or what the to-do is. So within the request, we actually have to pass in what the to-do is. So within the request, we have to pass in the to-do itself. And we actually do that inside of the request body. So just to quickly illustrate this, I have another request here, a post request of /to-do. And if I want to pass data in, I would pass that in inside of the request body. So let's actually go over here. So to reach this place, what you would need to do is to go to body, and then in here, make sure that you're on JSON. And over here, well, what is the title of the to-do? Well, I can change it to a proper to-do, maybe clean the house. So that is going to be the title of the to-do, and this is going to be passed along within the request. All right, awesome. So that is terrific, but before we do anything, what we need to do is tell Express that we need to parse the JSON, because over here we're passing the body as JSON. So what we're going to need to do, and this is something that we'll talk about a little bit later, is do something like app.use, and this is known as a middleware, and we'll talk about that in great detail a little bit later, do not worry. But then we're going to need to do something like parse or app.use and then express JSON. And what this simply does is say that, hey, you can utilize JSON within your application, your Express application. But we'll talk about middleware a little bit later, but for now, just understand that this is a very important step in order to get this data from the request. Okay, cool. So here, what we want to do is first, we want to get the title of the to-do. How do we get that? Well, we go to the request.body and then .title. So we get that from the request.body.title. Now, another way we can do it is simply destructure out the title from the request.body. So that's the exact same thing. Now what we want to do is assemble the new to-do. So what we want to supply it with is an ID that is a string. And we also want to supply it with the title, which is well defined over here. And we want to supply it with a completed status that initially is false. Okay. And now what we want to simply do is go ahead and inside of the to-dos array, I want to push that to-do, that new constructed to-do. And then to respond, what I want to do is respond with the new to-do that we added. This is something that I just want to do. I want to respond with the new to-do that I added. We could also respond with a success response, or we can respond with the array itself. But I think for most post requests that add data, you respond with the record that you added. Okay, now one thing that we need to address here is this over here. Well, this is just a string. We need a unique identifier. For this, what we can actually utilize is UUIDs. So let's go here, and what we can do is install a package called UUID. And what this will allow us to do, is create random IDs or string IDs for each particular record. So over here, what we can say is we want UUID, and we want to get that from well, UUID. Now in this case, I want a specific type of UUID known as the v4 UUID. You don't have to know what that means, but it has different algorithm that creates different strings. But at the end of the day, it's all unique strings. So what we can just say is we can destructure out v4. And what we can also do is say as UUID, or I guess that doesn't work here. I guess it only works in TypeScript. My apologies. So we can just say v4 here. And now over here, what we can do is say v4 and invoke it. And that's just going to create a brand new random string. Okay, so let's actually test this out. So this is a post request. So let's go to postman. And over here, what we can do is make this request. And let's go to the body. Seems like the request failed for some odd reason. How come I can't go to the body? This is kind of strange. Oh, there we go. Now we can open the body a little bit. So it seems like there's a bit of a problem. And okay, I see the problem actually. The problem is I have to have to-do. So this is a post request to to-dos. App.to-dos, not to-do. Let's make this request again. And now we have another error that I'm a little bit flustered about. Okay, another problem. We have to prepend the slash. So let's save that. And now I hope this is the one. There we go. So you can see we have added this brand new to do. And if we actually went and we made that get request, you can see here that we have the array of that specific to do. If I were to add another to do, let's say pet the cat, made that request, you can see we added this new record with a brand new UUID. And we can go ahead and send this off, and now we have an array of two to-dos. Okay, cool. And they both have unique IDs. All right, so this is terrific. Now what we need to do is, well, let's write the logic for getting one to do. Maybe we want to get just one to do. So as you can imagine, we are going to utilize an app.get. So this is app.get. We're going to do slash to-dos, but how do we get just one to do? Well, we need to uniquely identify what that to do is. And what better way to uniquely identify what the to do is than the ID itself? Because, well, that's just a unique identifier. So what we need to do is somehow pass the ID inside of the rec. Now you might be thinking, okay, the best way is to maybe pass it in the body. So we can have something like ID, and then over here, whatever the ID is, and we can parse it. And that would work. But the body is usually reserved for actual data that we actually want to utilize inside of the DB. Here, what we want to do is simply just fetch some data. And actually, the better approach is to do something like this, is to change the route handler. If I can get this, element, is to do something like this. So have to-dos and then slash the ID of the to-do we want to get. That right there is a better approach. Now the thing is this is always going to be dynamic. It's going to be changing depending on the ID of the to-do we want to get. So how do we specify that here in this handler? Well, we can specify that by saying colon and then whatever that dynamic thing is called. In this case, we're going to say ID. And so this can be anything, and we're going to store that thing in the ID parameter. Okay, so now let's do the rec res. And now we need to get this ID from the request. So what we can say is const ID. We can destructure out the ID from the request params. So we can destructure the ID from the request params. Awesome. And now what we want to do is we want to find that to do with this ID. So what we can say is to-dos.find, and then we can say something like, well, we want to iterate through every single element, and what we want to do is we want to find the to-do where its ID is equal to the ID that we have inside of our params. And then very simply, what we want to do is, well, return that to do. But of course, we need to do a res.json and then return it. Very simple, very, very simple. Okay, so one thing I do want to note, if I were to, as you can see here, we have two elements, but if I were to send this request, or actually let's get rid of this for now. If I were to send this request again to get our array, it's going to be an empty array. And the reason for this is because, well, we're storing this in a variable, and every single time we make a change and save it, we're restarting our server, and thus the to-dos is going to go back to an empty array. If we wanted to persist the data, of course, we would have to store it in a database. But just for simplicity's sake, I want to teach you Express. We're going to keep it as an empty array. Okay, cool. Now let's actually go ahead and let's create a to-do. Let's add a new to-do, pet the cat. And then let's grab this ID, and now I want to get a specific to-do. So let's make this request, and let's have this ID, and we should get back an object that contains that specific to-do. Awesome. So what's the next step? Well, the next probable step is to have the ability to update the to-do. So we need the ability to toggle whether this is true or false, the completed status. So let's go here, and for updating things, typically what we're going to utilize is put. So the verb put, and over here we're going to say to-dos, so slash to-dos, and then we have to figure out what to-do we want to update. Well, in this case, we can use the same thing over here. We can have the ID right in there. So we can have the ID in there. And that's really all the information that we need. So we have the rec res. And then what we can do is we can get the ID from the params. And now what we want to do is we want to find the element in our array that has that ID and then just change it. So what we can actually do is get the index of that specific element. That's actually a really good idea. You can do to-dos dot find, and then there's find index, and this, all it does is as soon as there's a condition that is met, it is going to return the index for that element. And then over here what we could say is to do, and then we're going to say to do dot id is equal to the ID that we have specified. So that's going to be the index of that element. And then what we can simply do is, well, to-dos of that index, and then dot completed, we're going to say that's equal to the to-do index dot completed, but the opposite of this, because this is going to return a Boolean value. So if this is true, it's going to go back to false. If it's false, it's going to go back to true. And then simply put, what we can do is a return res.json and to-dos.index. So in this case, we're returning the element that we have updated. So let's give this a go again. This should probably work. So let's add a new to-do, pet the cats, or pet the cats. Let's add this to-do. And now let's also add another to-do just for the sake of seeing things. Let's do clean the room. And now if you were to get our to-dos, you can see we get an array of these to-dos. Both of them are false. Let's say we have cleaned the room already. So what we can do now is make a put request. We can say slash to-dos slash this ID, update that, and you can see now it is true. And if you were to make this request again, you can see now that this is true. Now if I were to make this request again, it's going to toggle it back to false, and over here it will be back to false. All right. So the last route handler that I think is important is deleting. We want to delete our to-dos. So as you can imagine, there's another verb that we can utilize called .delete. So in this case, we of course have to identify which to-do we want to delete. So let's do the same thing. To-do :id. We're going to do rec res. And then in here, let's copy this. We want to get the ID from the request. And then what we want to do is, well, we want to delete that to do. So let's actually filter out all of the, or let's filter out the to do that matches this condition. So very simply, what we can say is new to dos is equal to, and, or sorry, actually, what we can do is we can say const, or we can say to dos is equal to, and we can actually make this, turn this into a let instead of a const. So we can say to-dos is equal to to-dos dot filter, and then we can filter for each to-do. And what we want to do is return all of the to-dos that have IDs that are not the one that we have passed in our parameter. Very simple. And then for this, what we could do is very simply just return the to-do list. All right, let's try this again now. So let's add this. Let's add pet the cat. Let's make this request over here. You can see that we have gotten this. And let's say we want to just completely delete pet the cat. So let's make a new request here. This is going to have the delete verb. And let's just copy this. Kind of copy that in there. And what we want to do is we want this ID. And let's also, we can also rename it, delete to do, save that. And then in here, what we can say is we want to delete this to do and send this off, send this request. Now we get an array of, well, the to-dos with that deleted to do. But to double check, we can also make this request and you can see that that to do is completely gone. And that's pretty much it. That's really all you have to know for Express, because Express is just a way for creating routes. Now, one thing is that this is kind of getting a little bit messy. So how can I make this, well, less messy? So one thing that we could do, instead of having all our routes live in one file, we can actually group them together in multiple files. So for example, we can have multiple routes. Over here, all these routes have a to-do within them, but we can have other routes like, I don't know, app.get, and then this is like something like /animals. For some reason, in our application, we have a to-do application as well as an animals application. What we can do is we can group all of these to-dos routes in one file, and then group all of the animal routes in another. So that's just a very simple thing that we can actually do. And let's actually do that right now. So what we can do here is create a routes directory. So we're going to create a routes directory. And in here, we're going to say that inside of this file, we have this to-do.js file. And inside of here, we're going to have all of our to-do routes. So let's go here and let's just cut everything out. We're going to completely cut everything out. We're going to paste it right in there. So we're going to paste that right in there. And instead of using app, we're going to use something else called router. So we're going to get that from const, and then we're going to get router from, where it's going to be equal require express, and then dot router. And we're going to go ahead and invoke this. What this is going to do is allow us to create these routes without the app. So we're going to go here, and instead of app, we're going to say router, 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 and then router. And then at the very end, we're going to do a modules.exports, and we're going to go ahead and export that router. And so now what we can do in here, and of course what we need to do is get this and paste that in there because we're utilizing the UUID. In here, to actually use these routes, what we can do is something similar to what we did here. We can say app.use, and then here, the first thing that we can specify is a string of the of a common path that every single route inside of this handler will utilize. I'll talk about that a little bit later. But then we can specify the file where the routers live. In this case, it's going to be /routes/to-dos. So if we were to save this, and we need to actually get the to-dos and put it in here as well. So we can save that and save this. You can see here, drastically simplified our file, but we can still make the same requests. So you can see here, we get an array of nothing, but we can of course add a to-do. We can get a to-do. We can also update a to-do. And then we can also delete a to-do. All right, awesome, possum. All right, so this is terrific. But okay, but what is this string that I was talking about? This where is it? This string right here. Well, this is going to be a common path that is going to exist on every single route inside of this file. Now let's actually go here, and we can see that there is a common path, /todos. For every single route, we have /todos. So what we can actually do is, instead of defining that here in the routes, what we can say is every single route handler will be /todos. And then inside of here, we can actually get rid of the to-dos, because it's going to be /todos. Because if we left the /todos, then it's going to be /todos/todos. And just to prove that to you, right now, if I go here and I make this request again, we don't have it. So because the first path is /todos, but we're also saying that we want another /todos. And if we were to make this request again, we see it. But obviously, this is not something that we want. So what we can do is we can get rid of this. 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 And we can get rid of this. And anytime we want to actually append something to the route, we can just simply do something like this. So we know it's going to be /todos/ whatever it is. So if we were to save this and we were to make this request again, it is exactly the same. All right, awesome. So the last thing I want to very quickly discuss is middleware. And middleware is actually what we're doing here with the app.use. So middleware is something that runs before it actually reaches the route handler. So first of all, we make the request. It is intercepted by middleware. The middleware is going to be doing something, and then it's going to send that off to the router. So one very common use case for middleware is actually adding authentication. So when you make a request, the middleware gets it. It checks if you're authenticated and you're authorized to make that request. If you're not, it's going to throw an error and it's never going to reach that route handler. But if you are, then what it's going to do is just going to forward the request to the route handler. And so that is middleware, and we actually utilize middleware with app.use. So over here, the express.json, what it's doing is, before we're getting our request to our route handlers, we're parsing the JSON. So that's exactly what we're doing here with app.use. So let's add a very simple authentication middleware. It's not going to be cumbersome or difficult at all. It's going to be very, very easy. So we're going to go here and we're going to add middleware. Let's create a middleware directory. And in here, we're going to create a checkauth.js file. So we're going to create a checkauth.js file. Now, inside of here, we're going to have, well, our middleware that's going to check if we're authenticated. And to check if we're authenticated, we're going to do something extremely simple. We're just going to check if you have a true or false value in the header, the request header. So another way we could actually store data is in the request header. So we can supply it with key value pairs. And over here, we're going to look for the authenticated status. So authenticated. And over here, the value, if it's yes, we're going to say awesome, you can move forward. But if it's no, then no, you cannot move forward. We're going to throw a forbidden error. Very simple. That's all we're going to do. So to create middleware, all we have to do is create a function. And so what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and right away export that function out. And this is similarly going to take in the request, the response, and then all we're going to do is we need to, of course, get this value from the header. Remember, the key is authenticated. So what we can do here is we can say const authenticated is equal to rec.header, and then we can invoke this and pass in the key, which is authenticated in this case. Let's pass that in there. Okay. And so simply, if authenticated triple equals yes, then what we're going to do is we want to actually just move on to the actual route handler. Because remember, this is going to live in the middle between the request and the actual route. So to say that we want to move on, there's actually a second or third parameter that we can utilize called next. And so simply what we can do is just invoke next, and that's either going to move on to the next middleware or the route handler itself, whatever is next down the line. All right. And now else, what we can do is else, well, you're not authenticated at this point. So what we want to do is we want to do a res.json, and we want to say message, we can say not authenticated. And what we also want to do is not return a 200 response, but return another meaningful response. So typically when something is forbidden, we can say that this is a 400 response. So to change the response, we can say .status and then 403 and then append .json. So let's save this. And now what we want to do is actually utilize this middleware within these routes themselves. This is also a very simple process. So what we can do is over here, we can add in between the path and the actual callback that has a route, we can add as many middleware as we want. In this case, I want to add the check auth middleware. So the check auth middleware, and you can notice that I actually automatically appended it or imported it. So now if you were to save this, and let's go to our header, we're going to say no. You can see here that we're not authorized, and there's a 403 forbidden. If I were to change this to yes, now we are actually authorized to do this. And of course, we could do this for every single path here. Let's just have a check auth for every single one, because we want to be authenticated for every single one. And this is obviously not the authenticated system that would happen in real life, but it's just an example. All right, and that's pretty much it. That's really all you have to know for Express. It's really simple. I love the framework, and you can really utilize it to build very important and powerful REST APIs.